I hope we have peeps. So we are now
Yeah,
live.
we do.
So
it went from 3 to 4 to 5. So
okay, so the peeps are joining,
Okay.
which is fantastic. Welcome everybody that's joining us now, and like usual, we'll get started in just a minute. Give people time to actually sign on. So yeah, I'll definitely look up the rest of her books. That would be fantastic. One of these days, I want to get the author of Bark to do a presentation for us. I mean, we just covered winter tree ID in what, 3 sessions of backyard forestry. So we're kind of good, although our peeps will probably say differently because they want more.
yeah, they want more of Kieran.
Yeah, but I think it'd be good to have Michael pop on at some time. And I'd still like to have Doug Tallamy join us as well. He does a great presentation. So
There's
lots of good stuff.
I've got to think of the guy's name, and it may be the guy who wrote Bark, but I don't think it is. There's a book about forest forensics that's quite good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think, well, I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like that's his only book. Like, cause I go to his website to order them.
Okay.
And I mean, he does presentations and stuff like that, but I do not recall another book. I will check into that. Forest forensics.
Yeah, I've got it here someplace. I can get you an ISBN and all that stuff.
Excellent. Excellent.
Well, I see we are at 53 right now.
Maybe give just a moment more for people to join. So we don't want to be too late going in. It's weird having it sort of still light out too, right? I mean, I love it, mind you, but it's good. People might still be out playing in the garden and whatnot.
In the rain.
Planting trees. It was sunny not that long ago.
Really?
I mean, it rained, but then here it got sunny.
Yeah, we're waiting for the snow to start.
Oh, stop.
Seriously, we're getting it tonight.
Really?
Yeah. I called my daughter. She's about 40 miles northeast of me. They're already getting the lake effect band kind of thing going on.
My goodness.
So you're up in Syracuse now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any word on Fid the Adventure Dog? We're okay.
Adventure Dog went through surgery like a champ. They actually checked his previous, and that's well healed. So he's coming home tomorrow morning.
Oh, that's good news. Fantastic.
Oh, we're going to stock up on extra milk bones for the bravery.
Oh, absolutely. What a good doggy. Been through a lot, so that's good.
He makes an appearance tonight in the show. So.
Oh, good. We always like to see pets. Yeah, I had to close my door off so that I didn't have any interruptions. Otherwise, there'd likely be cats and whatnot coming through, usually eating the flowers in the back. It's always a fan favorite. And if Kieran was here, everybody always wants his cats to be participating. So it's good that you have Finn. Yeah, he puts hats on him. All right, we should get started. We're having too much fun. Let's keep the fun going. Okay, so welcome everybody to April's Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes online program. We're glad you're here tonight. My name is Lori Jensen, Executive Director of the New Jersey Forestry Association, and we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce Andy Kim, which is the president. Andy, how are you tonight?
I'm good. Welcome everybody. Looking forward to another exciting presentation of Backyard Forestry in 90 minutes, and we'll get rolling right along here. Okay. We have presentations we usually give at the beginning. Most of you have probably seen it. We do have a May 20th will be our next date. We don't have the exact topic for that. We're considering several topics, and of course, if anybody has topics that you would like to discuss in this forum, send them over to Lori. And if you know a presenter, that would be good. I know we have a lot of topics. Getting the presenters is a bit of a challenge sometimes. So we are going to continue. We've got several topics. It's just a matter of putting them in the right sequence. So we do support forest landowners. That's been the primary objective of the New Jersey Forestry Association. As you can see here, there are a number of things we do: newsletters, website, the annual meeting, which was a couple weeks ago remotely this year, Woodland Stewards Program, which we hope to have again in the fall this year. Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes, which is this. We do represent landowners in Trenton, and we monitor legislation. Actually, there's some stuff going on right now that we're monitoring pretty closely on prescribed burn and a couple other things. There was one hearing a couple weeks ago. There's another one next week. So we are monitoring the legislation that may be of importance to people who are interested in the forest. So we also support non-woodland owners. Of course, the benefits of a healthy forest are fresh air, clean water, recreation, wildlife habitat, forestry education. Of course, the forestry education would be this program. It would be the Woodland Stewards program. So and they're open to everybody. One of the things we do as well is we do offer now quarterly member-only meetings for members of the New Jersey Forestry Association. While the Backyard Forestry is open to everybody, the member-only meetings are going to be for members only. So if you are not a member, certainly you can join today. It's only $55, and it allows us to put together programs like this and some of the other things that we do. Just go to www.newjerseyforestry.org and sign up, and away we go.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So moving right along, it is my pleasure to actually introduce our presenter. How did that get there? Sorry if I'm throwing you off. I had to, Jason. But if I can talk without laughing too much, I just also wanted to say before you begin, Jason, that for attendees, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, there is a Q&A box. Please feel free to use that, post your questions in there. And Jason has said that he'll kind of check in with me and we'll kind of answer questions as we go along, or we will save time at the end as well to answer questions. So questions in the Q&A, feel free to stop by and say hi in the chat box. So chat to say hi, Q&A to answer or to ask questions. So Jason Grabosky, professor in urban forestry, Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers, the State University. He's also a tree geek, right? Had to say that. Owner of Finn, the adventure dog, and does a lot of research in urban forestry and also teaches classes in forestry. So we are thrilled to have you. Thank you for doing this tonight. Looking forward to it. And I'm going to stop sharing. Bye, George. See you soon. And Jason, take it away.
Mr. Clooney's a wannabe. You know how it is.
Exactly, right? Yeah.
Okay.
He's aspiring to be you, but you know, it's hard.
Well, you know, it's hard. It's a lot of pressure to be that.
Yes, yes. One of these days.
So here we go. We're talking about jargon and forestry. We're going to focus on 6 words. And I'm just going to escape for a moment because I didn't take my pictures across here, and I really want to have a couple of faces to see. I apologize for the delay here. Okay, now can you see it? Are we good there, Lori?
Yeah, looks great. Looks great.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to talk about 6 very important words in forestry in the most general sense. And while we could guess what they are, I think what we're going to really focus on is the terms afforestation, reforestation, proforestation. And then we're going to delve a little bit into some of the ecology terms that inform some of our responses and strategies around those first 3 terms. And as we do that, I'm going to start this slide as a preamble to everything else we're going to talk about. A lot of people talk about research and development, and some people talk about forestry as an application, forestry as an industry, forgetting that that is a science-informed practice. Forest science is actually an entire niche, an entire disciplinary area that can fall within ecology. It can fall within pathology. And as such, I like showing a slide like this because there are a lot of different ways we can ask meaningful scientific questions. And some people get confused when I start throwing out my academic jargon about applied research versus basic research. So I show you this slide. And this comes from an international consensus document about how we legally define terms such as basic research and applied research, which sounds kind of wonky, except for the way we grant national and international research grants. The terms have to be legally defined. So here they are. And just conceptually, basic research is that blue sky, gosh, I saw something in nature. Why does it work that way? I'm not really trying to solve a particular problem. I'm trying to understand something. So the time that takes to go from a solution or that aha moment in research to actually being useful to somebody may be a pretty long time. So that's a long-term time to market adoption or finding its way into the general market. You can think about the idea that, you know, I could digest corn. Instead of making moonshine liquor, I could actually make a fuel that I could burn in an internal combustion engine. Tactical research is a bit different. That's research that happens when, you know, we can make corn ethanol as a drop-in fuel, but how do we make it so it's stable and scalable? And so then you get somebody like DARPA or the military coming in and saying, you know, if you can make it at this price point and to deploy this, we'll give you money so we can move it towards the market. Applied research, we know what we want, we know kind of how to do it, but now we're talking about, we already have a proof of concept. We're trying to figure out how to best deploy that. And then innovation is when we take stuff all along that continuum of research from that first basic question, which may have no market value at all. And how do we deploy that so that we can have results in the field immediately? When we talk about disruptive research, that's when you take something from basic and it's like, oh, we're going to skip everything and go right into innovation. So this is not a law or a rule, but this is the general trajectory, and you see that they overlap. And so when I talk about McIntyre-Stennis funding, which is federal formula funding for forestry research, that is specifically applied research. If I have a basic question, that will not get funded. That's for your National Science Foundation. That's for your National Institutes of Health, whereas tactical could be National Institutes of Health, Environmental Protection Administration. Okay, so I just put this out there because when we're talking about these terms, I want us to know where our underpinnings are and where we are on this curve. So thank you for that diversion. Let's get into it. We're going to start with a term called aforestation. And there are a lot of different ways that we can define it. I'm going to define it my way because I'm the speaker and that's my prerogative. Ha! I scoff at Merriam-Webster. I don't care. This is what I say tonight. We can look at it as a management action. And the idea here is that we're intentionally developing a forest community where there is not a forest now. That could be a parking lot. That could be a farmer's field. That could be an area that just has never supported a forest in the past many years due to pollution. It could be that it could have been a forest at one point, but it's been managed otherwise. That's different than the policy approach, where that's a preference and attitude and using the levers of governance to have a dispositional change in land use toward forest landscapes. I hope that makes sense to everybody, but that's really important. You know, when we start thinking about that, it can return lands that were previously forested, but then transition to something else, like a farm field. But then if we abandon that farm field, it can revert naturally to another forest. That's dependent on soils, that's dependent on water, but most importantly, it depends what arrives to build that community. And in forestry, one of the things we do, or we hope that we're doing in forest management planning or silviculture, is directing that trajectory towards a preferred move based on the values of that landowner. So it's really about figuring out what are your values and moving towards those values. And we can think of the abandonment of northeastern farms after World War II, and even back in the 1880s, at some point at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that have, when they revert to forest, that is a passive afforestation. We could have an active afforestation where we choose to move those fields into trees. And when we do either of those, that can either be natural colonization, or we can guide it as humans in an artificial colonization. And that could be by adding things in to arrive and compete, or holding something back like an invasive species that we'd rather not have. Okay. As an example, here we have an area in China, and they took this entire mountain forested landscape out of forestry, and they turned it into agricultural fields based on their population movements to feed Beijing and other parts of China. And when they realized what their population program was doing as far as its effectiveness, they took land out of agriculture and they actively replanted parts of this forest over 40 years. And that's afforestation over 4 decades. And it was really kind of cool. They traded space for time because they had really good records. And because they had virtually unlimited labor, they had very careful control of what they planted and did. And they took these mountainous landscapes. I'll see if I can get my cursor here. You can see the slope here. This was not great land, but they were growing food wherever they could. And they returned it back to forest. That's afforestation, artificial regeneration. All of this stuff was placed, but then its natural reproduction, its natural generation is now taking over. It's moving rather quickly because of the choices they made early on to reestablish this forest. We've done this in the United States. This is an area near where I am sitting right now. This is a Civilian Conservation Corps planting from the 1930s in the Roosevelt era. These are all Norway spruce. This is part of a hilltop forested stand that was in hops production because we have great soils here for hops. But due to prohibition crashing the markets for hops and then having an onslaught of fungal issues, hops was not coming back. It was going to Oregon at that point. These spruce trees still exist today. You can, we're now coming on 80 years old. It's a uniform, single species, single age stand, getting ready for a transition. There's a few gaps in and about, but you can see this is a very well manicured stand. Next to this was a Scotch pine stand. Next to that, there was yet a different thing. And so now we're getting in pushes with new species as some of these trees are starting to fail or age out. Here's Finn the Wonder Dog, and he just loves it here because there's enough stuff in atrophy that he finds sticks larger than his body to run and get stuck in between the trees. What a life. The problem is, we can plant something and we can have a plan for something, but in forestry, time is a very interesting temporal consideration. And our values in the 1930s are not the values we have today. And we have a stand that was built to be harvested that now is not getting harvested. But on some of the shallower soils, this is one of those spruce trees very shallow soil on the hill, wet summer, a good wind, and you can see these trees have a root system and they're less than 14 inches deep. Look at the size of some of these big root plates in the background. These trees just flop, and now what do you do with all that wood? What we've done is we've opened a gap. We have almost no soil and then hummocks of soil developing. And now we're getting a new forest starting to come in. But what do we do with all the carbon that's on the ground degrading? And so one thing we have to think about whenever we talk about forestry and land management is how stable are the values? And if we can keep good notebooks, if we understand the values in play when choices were made, we stand a much better chance through good record keeping of adapting our management to the new rules of the game now with something like climate change or something like emerald ash borer on our ash forests. We can think about changing and adapting our management strategies as the rules on the ground change and how the values as a society or the landowner changes. Here's a different afforestation. The one in the CCC, it was an agricultural system that was moved into forestry. This was land that did not exist. This is all clinker bits and sintered fly ash from New York City. And they built this land for a railway terminal. And this was all rail yard. And when that was abandoned, it was left and it looked like a moonscape, frankly, because people were afraid to be here. And it was just rock. It was a moonscape. And then things invaded, stuff like Phragmites. We think of it as this terrible invasive and mugwort coming in. Oh, heavens to Betsy me. And it grew and it died, and it grew and it died, and it grew and it died, and started building organic materials. And suddenly we had some lichen communities coming in, some moss communities coming in, and then boom, all of a sudden, Poplar starts erupting, a spontaneous urban forest, because we had patience enough to let succession begin. Instead of it being a disturbance with a resetting of the landscape, this is land that was built and the conditions were right for a forest to erupt. There's some really cool questions on how this occurred, but we do know we have a nascent forest and we have birch populations. And we can talk about forest resilience here now because Sandy took a huge swipe at Liberty State Park. And we have researchers mainly led by Frank Gallagher, Dr. Frank Gallagher. And we're looking at the rebound growth of those birch trees after Sandy as a resilient forest population on this property. So when we think about afforestation as a policy, there's an argument that we could use this as a national model and do a great deal of learning about afforestation in an urban context, instead of turning it into play fields and other developmental opportunities. We also know that there's already wild turkey inhabiting this spot. We know there's other wildlife coming in, and we see oak trees coming in. So we have an upland hardwood assemblage developing, and we're seeing succession right before our eyes within a generation, a professional generation of people. It's happening rather quickly, but it is an artificial system. So we don't understand time in artificial systems. We also know that this is the 9/11 memorial planting at Jersey City, at Liberty State Park. And we know that the seeds can serve as recruitment for coming into here. So there's some really interesting things that we can think about when we think about afforestation. And what you can see part of Jersey City, Manhattan, you can kind of see back over to the right, you'd see the Statue of Liberty. This does not look like Jersey City to me. I don't know as it looks like Jersey City to you. We have other examples of where this could be happening. Here we have a designed cap over a contaminated area with very specific depths of soil and protection zones so we can grow trees and a forested community on top of that cap without exposing it to the yeasty beasties and nasties that we capped on this contaminated Superfund site. And we spent a lot of time looking at that. As goes the soil, so goes your plant community. And as goes your plant community, so goes your animal community. So knowing your soil, the advantage of some of these synthetic systems for afforestation, because it wasn't a forest before. If you understand the soil, you can understand the management. If you understand the water, you control the success or failure of that system. That's a very important thing to remember. It's about water. Afforestation, we can look at that now that we're in the regional greenhouse gas initiative. Afforestation could be considered a carbon offense tool if we buy into the idea that a forested community is going to become a net sink and an efficient way of grabbing carbon and locking it into place. But we have to remember carbon is only one, that's only one unit of value. Water is important. There are other things, little things like food are also important. So while we want to look through a lens of carbon right now, 50 years from now, that may be a very different question. So we want to be very thoughtful and not single-minded when we start making decisions about the disposition of our land. And you've probably all read this slide already, so I'm not going to read it to you, but I would suggest that afforestation, at least in New Jersey, is a safe bet on a long timeline because we have the water budgets and the soils to support forests. You cannot say that in parts of the Midwest. You really can't say that in the deserts in the Southwest. But right here, it's a pretty good bet, which then nearly as much energy to create an afforestation event. And so that plays to our advantage. But because there's not a forest there, you're going to start with something that looks pretty puny and probably doesn't look much like a forest. You better adopt patience, or at least a good sense of humor. And if you're starting at a very specific early successional stage, you could think of it as an invasion of a new vegetation community enabled by you, the human. And not all invasions have to be bad. It's just how we interpret these things. It also means that if you choose less than appropriately, there are other things that will outcompete and make your life very difficult in establishing. And that's where you hire, they can understand what your values are and help you move and give you those options on how you may want to move and what it might look like over time. And so here's our first poll question coming up. And you've already seen the slide. So you blathering on while you do your poll question here. But when we think about afforestation, we have very solid anchorage points and theoretical constructs within the basic research. And we have decades to well over centuries of how this plays out and how we understand it should play out within a tactical research realm, moving all the way up into applied research. As a matter of fact, I was pointing out, this is Gifford Pinchot's primer of forestry from the late 1880s to early 1900s. Gifford was one of the rock stars. And in here, he spends the first part of his text talking about how afforestation for ecological protection should play out. So we do have a lot of documentation, but our understanding and the personal computer has really revved up how we're putting together pieces now and how we're assimilating information. So we see a lot of innovation right now in areas of modeling. We see also this new thing that we'll talk about at the end of the presentation about tiny, a novel way of looking at afforestation.
Okay, Jason, we're at about 73% of people. We'll give them maybe 10 more seconds to respond, and then I'll share the results with everybody.
Okay. Dun, 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 dun. So when we think about afforestation, we can jump in at any one of these areas and drive down to the basic or drive up to the application on wherever you're at in this continuum. And when we think about forest management that's scientifically based or data-based decision-making, it has to do with the notebooks, the organized observations, and all of these different pieces from which we build a prescription. Entire textbooks, entire university curricula are based around these topics, and they're all grounded. So none of this is really new. How we deploy it is always a little bit new because dynamic systems always change. And that's why applied and innovation get to be really important. Then we have our results.
Pretty mixed.
Yeah, we have a mixed age.
We're diverse.
We are, in its own way. Everything's diverse in its own way. Thank you, folks, for participating. This helps us. It helps us target programs, and it helps us understand who we're talking to. Now, a different type of thing is reforestation. Here's word number 2. Again, we're going to think of it as a management action and also as a policy approach. And in a management action, the difference between afforestation and reforestation is really what was there before. And if we had a forest and for some reason that forest is non-functional for some intercession, the redevelopment of that forest community or a slightly changed forest community recognize that table has changed. We're going to call that reforestation. From a policy standpoint, it's about retention of that land use and that land resource for a value or probably a suite of values, which means that there's multiple users. When we talk about as a management action, usually we're talking about a response to a disturbance. A disturbance is something that takes out trees or takes out parts of a community within a forest. It doesn't have to be the trees, but we usually look at the trees as being that dominant feature. And that can range from something that's totally catastrophic. Think of Mount St. Helens having its geopyrotechnical belching that it did that just leveled parts of a mountainside, to having where we have drought repression of, say, photosynthetic activity in sugar maples, followed by a moist year with a huge eastern tent caterpillar outbreak that totally defoliates that forest and sets it back. And it may be 2 or 3 years, but it will come back. So there's different levels of disturbance here. It's a question of scale, though. A disturbance in reforestation could be the reestablishment of forest function within what some may call a gap. I think of gaps as being a little bit dimensionally too small. Patches we can argue about, and I would go with patch, but really I tend to think of reforestation when we're talking at a stand level or a forest level. People can argue about that, and it's a good debate to have because we actually are on the same team. We're just trying to adapt our jargon to encapsulate the problem at hand. But when we think about reforestation, recruitment is more than likely from the surroundings or from the preceding condition. If you had a forest and a derecho comes in and blows everything down, and it looks like a bomb went off, or a small Mount St. Helens without the benefit of lava, well then, probably there's natural recruitment and a seed bank there where you may see things rebound, and then it's up to the forestry professional to help you bias the success of the regeneration in that system. Of course, if what is going to come up is, say, a sugar maple, and that's not the species you're going to want in 40, 50 years due to climate change, then maybe you want to say, well, how do I make this look a little bit more hickory today? So that, you can talk about how you would look at that. So it can look very similar to an artificial system if what you're doing is taking this interruption in a plan and adapting your management to maintain ecological services, but with a slightly different look and community. Think of it like what's happened with the Boston Red Sox, trading away all their good players and everybody being in misery until they start winning again, which I guess they're doing. It's about the team and the uniform. It's not necessarily the players. When we think about forestry, we have to be thinking about ecological functions and think about trajectories, not necessarily the individuals in those slots, although we do spend our time looking at that. There's also this bigger picture, what a consulting forester can do for you. We can have something like Superstorm Sandy, a beautiful dry storm where we saw this happens to be a cedar swamp in southern New Jersey, but it damaged white pine because the saltwater air blew in and never got washed off. It was a dry storm. So we had a disturbance on the white pines where they were left standing but dying because the salt plasmalized and changed the structure of the wax on the needles, so the needles literally cooked on the trees, suffocating. Or you have a blowdown, looks like this. And what this is a reforestation event where they took out some material from the blowdown. They salvaged what they could, and they're having the cedars reestablishing within the system. And where the seeds could blow in from the surrounding area, they let wind distribution work in their favor. Where it was too far away from the forest, they hand planted. And where they had red maple coming in, they used a method of a very weak herbicide, not to kill the red maple, but to knock them back long enough for the cedar to outcompete the red maple. So these can be rather sophisticated reforestation programs. And we're always thinking about reforestation because we know that trees die. As living organisms, they're gonna die. It's just that many of them are on a different life cycle trajectory than us, and we think they live forever, but they don't. And trees will die. And as we see the trees dying, nature hating a vacuum, something else is going to come in. And as our climate is changing, it means that the fitness landscape for what's appropriate in our forests may or may not change, depending how we phrase the question and depending on the timeline we're playing with. And so if I tend to be a huge devotee of Sewall White on this fitness landscape, and I look at the success of forest communities and individual species walking over a fitness landscape, and when certain environmental pressures get to be so high that the plants can't climb the hill, they fall out of your inventory. And where it's really low, they may aggregate. So we usually try to understand our environment. From that, we understand the trajectory foresting or reforesting. I want to know what's there now I want to know what its fitness is 30, 50 years out. So I want to model that new environment and see if I've got fitness. And we have tools to do that. Well, I'm going to tell you, this is more of a slide for a different audience, but we're going to plant today with an eye to the future environment. And what I encourage anybody who has wet areas on their properties to look at because the New Jersey of 2070 is going to bear a striking resemblance to these forest systems, particularly in the South Carolina Piedmont soils, if I happen to be in the Piedmont soils of central New Jersey, along, say, the Delaware-Raritan Canal, along the Raritan River. And you'll see that many of the species are the same as what we have, but they may operate a little bit differently. So the professional forester is going to be looking at that and saying, okay, how do we use that knowledge? How do we use that tactical research and apply it to this new system that is the New Jersey of tomorrow? That's how we play the game. And the game's going to be about water. When it's not, it's about water. If it's not there, it's going to be something to do with water, unless it has something to do with wind. Because with slightly higher temperatures, you get more discernible frontal boundaries, and you get higher wind speeds as the hot air moves up and the cold air rushes down. So we think of wind as a disturbance, and we're likely to see wind as an increasing disturbance as wind speeds pick up. So we're thinking about that as far as forest structure, or we should be. And anybody who's known me, I am an oak because I work on the ballast model. I have a really low, wide ballast center of gravity. We call it compressive buttressing in the root system. I call this my work boots. I'm not one of those willowy things. But we see that trees adapt for the wind. And I just show this because I just think this is just so smoking cool. This is something that Steve Vogel, who was at Duke, did this in a wind tunnel. This is a tulip poplar leaf at low wind speed, going from about 5 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour. And you can see in turbulent winds, they fold on their keel and they wrap like a cigar to lower drag. Because if you are a tulip poplar and you can grow 120 feet in the Delaware water gap on the edges of those ravines, guess how the wind concentrates and blows through those things? There's a place called Wind Gap, Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. Isn't that a cool adaptation? We want to think about that. What trees are going to deal with that? How about flooding? We know that the shoreline about 20,000 years ago was nowhere near where it is now. We know it's still changing, and the bright green here are areas that are going to have at least semi-permanent to permanent water on site. I'm not going to plant dry site species plants there. Just not going to happen. Think about where our populations are. There's going to be a lot of people moving, or they're going to be investing in a lot of waterproof shoes. Flooding is a disturbance that is going to be an incredible filter on parts of our state. And so we want to think about that. But we also want to think about how we conserve our resources and deploy them, because we're going to have large-scale human movements as we displace coastal communities. Where are those people going to go? And what are the challenges and the opportunities in all of that new infrastructure that has to be built? So reforestation, with that little aside, it can guide a system community trajectory. We can think of this as a carbon offense in the early stages, but it's actually a carbon defense if we're controlling the disposition of the land on a long-term scale. So to me, this is where a lot of people end up playing. The nice thing about using the silvicultural systems approach to reforestation, we can actually build disturbances on a controlled scale and a controlled intensity to bias the trajectory so that we can have a diversity of habitats. Because if you only have one type of habitat, any of the other users of the other habitats aren't going to be around very long. They will be around until the day action lifespan of that organism. And then they're going to be somewhere else. Because if they can't reproduce in your area, they're not going to be there. So here's our next poll question. And while you're doing your next poll question, reforestation actually probably has more of a research base in the US, and certainly an equivalent to possibly longer in the European and quite possibly some of the Asian databases, because we know what it's like to overpopulate, cut off all of our forests, and then have to replant them. And so we do have a lot of basic research. Our innovations here really are since the generation of computers and our ability to look at machine learning and do better and better simulation models where we can go in and build a sim city, only instead of it being a city, it's a forest. And we can insert the disturbance in scope and in intensity and simulate anything from a forest fire to a windstorm or to a silvicultural cut, and then see what grows back. What are we enabling? So that's where most of our innovation's coming from. Our question is, do you know what these terms mean? Well, if you don't, the horse has been beaten. It's darn close to dead, but we'll see. We're only in term 2 and we're almost an hour in. Let's keep going. I'm saying, come on, Jason, keep talking, keep talking. We only have a few people. Oh, we got 77 people in here. Here we go. It's looking good. Thank you. So you're still a bit confused. So afforestation, just to review the 2 we've got so far. Afforestation, you're building a forest that was not a forest before. You're allowing a forest to develop where there was a forest. So with reforestation, there's probably a shift in structure, but it's probably an age class or a structure in the site, but it was a forest already, so it's just going to be a bit different. Again, here we have this spruce stand. We see the inevitable. This stand is going to turn into something else. What that is probably going to mean that this structure is going away. Since they're all the same age, it's probably going to happen all about the same time. So in a silvicultural plan, I would probably do this in a controlled manner and allow the next thing to come and bias that. That would be a reforestation of this site after I take out the majority of this biomass and use it for something else. So here's proforestation. This one's a little different. This is strictly a policy approach at this point. The essential point of proforestation is one of promoting forest communities and of the conservation of existing communities. Okay, so basically it's the same thing as afforestation and reforestation, although it's an attitude and a presumption that that's what you want to do. And so if you've got somebody that would rather be growing food, you've got an argument on your hands. But you're basically looking to develop more forests or conserve what you already have. This goes all the way back to Pinchot and what they called the protection forests, particularly around our water supplies. That was a very pro-forestation argument that was then operationalized against the French meaning of organized forestry versus the Germanic organization of forestry. And we ended up pulsing a little bit more Germanic, but again, this goes back a long ways as a policy approach, but it's only found voice as a term relatively recently. It's really devolving to a certain extent into a political action argument to enable the development of long-lived forest communities. And that's usually looked at by defining increase or maximization of the average age within the dominant canopy individuals. And by doing that, some people are potentially arguing against rational silviculture, and we can argue that at some point, but it begs a lot of assumptions. And the thing is, there's not a lot to argue from here because this is relatively new stuff, at least for the northeastern forest, because it's predicated on arguments based exclusively on forests that are older than anything we have in our system to manage. So when we say that, you know, as we have more United States deciduous forests transitioning into a 100-year plus age class, we're in an area of rapid learning. And while we have a lot of anchorage in the basic here, we may see this as a disruptive leapfrogging almost into this box of applied innovation as we learn how our forests are growing in almost real time with the benefit of machine learning and some really good work over the past century of people keeping careful notebooks. But the thing is, we aren't there yet. So that it's something that we're working at. But one thing we do know is that not all of our forest systems will be primed or even appropriate for a proforestation approach. Because when we look at this, we tend to couch it in a limited number of terms, and forestry, if nothing else, is about looking at many different vectors before making a decision. And this is probably one of the biggest ones, and it's about the land itself and about carrying capacity. The land can produce and provide for a set amount of activity. As goes the soil, so goes your plant community. And nutritionally bereft, water-lacking soil will grow something, but it's not going to grow as much as something that's nutrient-rich with the ability to mineralize more from its underlying geology with unlimited or relatively unlimited amounts of water. So the carrying capacity, and while we may have many trees coming at one stage, if we go for only the biggest and oldest ones, you will get them, but the land will only hold so much. So you're choosing to concentrate your biomass into fewer and fewer individuals, which means that you have to think about your risk management. We have many, many trees. They will tend to, if they're all single species or very closely related species, you can get both root grafts that are direct physiological grafts of tissue between the tree root systems, or you can get mycorrhizal communities that will inoculate and move resources within the community below ground. But as you get competition for light above with bigger and bigger trees, it means that you're going to have things shaded out and you're going to lose a few. So you can have 100 medium-sized trees, or you may have 20 really large trees. But if that's all the land will support, that's what the land will support. What do you want? The fewer bigger trees or more of the slightly smaller trees? That's a value judgment. And there's reasons to choose either of those. But you want to be sure of what you're choosing. And it shouldn't be about a term or popularity. It's, again, what we're seeing a lot with the proforestation movement is talking about the idea that bigger trees, they do have the ability to sequester a lot of carbon. And carbon is really sexy as one of our monetary units right now. So people are thinking about it. But if we look at a tree, and as it goes from 2-inch to 3-inch, 12-inch to 13-inch, you get the idea, 22 to 23, 32 to 33. We're going to add 1 inch of radial growth, and that's going to add quite a bit of area to the trunk on that big tree. A 1 inch ring on a 42 inch tree is a lot bigger than a 1 inch ring on a 2 inch tree. Makes sense, right? So if I have one big tree going from 42 to 43 inches, just in trunk area, I need at least 17 of those trees, because I've never seen a 0.6 of a tree that's successful. I'm just saying. So let's just call it 17. I need probably 17 2-inch trees to lay that same amount of growth on the trunk. That's kind of meaningless, because we really want to talk about volume. We want to talk about biomass. We want to talk about services of the canopy. And so we can do that, and we can multiply, and we can play fancy math. By the time you get a 22-inch tree versus a 42-inch tree, you may need 7 of those trees to do the same amount of biomass growth as that 42-inch tree. Now, if you have a 42-inch tree, anything that's within that 42-inch tree's canopy doing its 42-inch caliper tree thing, it's out competing everything else in that space. So you're going to have, for the same carrying capacity of the land, you're going to have vastly fewer big trees. So if you get a yeasty beastie called the big old red oak borer, guess what happens to your big old red oak? And do you want to have 7 opportunities or 1 opportunity to save that spot? It's a way of thinking about it. It's not right, it's not wrong, but it's a way of thinking about it. It's about occupancy and about what your portfolio looks like. And the idea is, we look at it in a different way. A 2-inch tree, if I add square inch trunk, if I double that in a year, okay, I'm going to have a growth rate of almost an inch. But if I have a 42-inch tree growing the same amount, it's only 0.06 thickness of a ring. When you count the rings in the tree, as the tree gets older, you'll notice they get smaller and smaller. Usually they're pretty uniform for many years, sometimes up to about 100 years or so. But around 120 with certain white oak species in central New Jersey, you see them go, and they just slow right down, and they get to be really, really dense and really, really thin. They're still putting on a lot of growth. But it's very, very, it's not tricky, it's complicated to get an apples to apples comparison of growth. And so be careful when people are trying to use quick and easy numbers to describe how one tree is doing something different than another. Here we have a poplar stand. This is actually aspen, but it's a populous species. And you can have these trees spreading by root grafts. This could all be biologically one tree, like pando. And as the canopies become dominant off, just because the canopy goes away does not mean necessarily that the root system goes away. And when you remove a tree in a system that happens to be even aged in this case, you can actually get release growth. And we actually have evidence that this to the surrounding trees, and that helps in that collection from that soil resource as carrying capacity to move that energy into fewer individuals to grow them bigger. But when we think about a proforestation approach, going for older, hence bigger trees, we have to account for the losses of the displaced trees. We have to think about the snags that we want to have as habitat for other things. And one thing we never talk about, because this is a difficult topic, if we have bigger trees, we probably have more internal cycling in the canopy as far as branches falling, dying. So So we have a feedback loop in how we're collecting carbon within the individual. And if there's any decay in that tree, we have no idea. We call it cryptocarbon. We have no idea of what is functional carbon in the system and what is carbon that's oxidizing, building hollows in our multi-centuries old trees. And if we're going to play the game of apportionment on carbon, we better have a good accrual table for the stuff that's coming in by the tree growing and what's going out of that tree in its natural cycle. If it was really easy, I'd look very different than I do now today. This comes from banging your head on the desk for hours at a time, particularly right after grading midterms from undergraduate students. When we look at the New Jersey forest system, and we're using the forest inventory analysis that's a national program, we have some stats, and some of us have probably already seen these stats. But about 40% of the land in New Jersey is in forest. About 48% is owned by people like you, and a little bit more than that is owned by the public, whether it's state, county, or federal. When we look at this data, look at the trees here in the 60 to 80 and the 80 to 100 range. This is where we're learning a lot about proforestation, but we're in the learning phase. We're not in the tactical phase yet. But you can see how our relative percentages of our forested lands are getting older. And we can see that our here's back in 1987, we have more trees in the 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and they've gone way down. We're getting older stands. And when we look at the age class and size class, we're getting older, bigger trees, which means if we have habitat needs in the younger forest areas, we're losing out. They're just not happening. But this is what you would expect out of New Jersey forests after planting from the Civilian Conservation Corps, followed by an abandonment of certain agricultural activities when we started using a lot of chemical fertilizers and moving our agricultural production into different sectors in land uses as land became more and more expensive in areas where there were a lot of people. So this actually is something that you probably could have seen several miles away. What we see in New Jersey is an increase in our diameter classes decade over decade, and we're seeing concomitant decreases in our smaller diameter classes because guess what? The soil can only hold so much. Fewer big ones or many more small ones, but you can't have both. So you have to make decisions for diversification of your habitat. And when we look at that as far as species, I'm just going to point out that with our expectations with climate change, American beech is not a winner in parts of New Jersey where it is now. They're going to be decreasing. White ash, we know what's happening with ash. This is going to change. It's probably going to fall right off the list very quickly. Sugar maple is moving out of here. Sweet birch is moving out of here. Red maple's staying put. Will probably become more popular because it's already here. It's incredible at colonizing, and we're going to have a vacuum or a space as sugar maple and sweet birch become less and less competitive due to the thermal loading of our systems. But we can look at these as winners and losers, and then we can impose things like our disease and pest envelope. This is the reduction in basal area in our forests comprised of oak due to gypsy moth. So the darker the color, the more nervous you really ought to be about your oaks in these areas. So we have climate taking out the competitiveness of some species, but that same thing is influencing the success of some of our yeasty beasties that take out species that will still be fit as long as they don't get taken out by diseases and pests. So that's a management thing that we have to look at. And it's not just our trees. We have all of the understory that we have to be thinking about as well. And so when we think about proforestry, and I'm not against the concept, but we have to be careful how we deploy it at this stage. It's an age thing. We don't know enough about northeastern forests, which is why most of the arguments are sourced in the tropical forest systems right now, as far as how they work, with this unfortunate thing that we don't have that many forests of age where we know exactly what's going to happen. We do know that if we have bigger trees, we're going to have fewer trees. And you have to accept that risk management proposal when you do that. We also notice that certain bird species in New Jersey are falling away because they are niche competitors in younger forest assemblage communities. So unless we manage for those on occasion, well, then I guess we just have to accept that certain animal species will be winners and losers, because as goes the soil, so goes the plant community. As goes your plant community, so goes your animal community. It's something we have to remember. We're talking about this because of carbon, because of water on occasion, because of money. And when we start talking about it, when we start talking about monetizing on single currencies, I think of this spider web. And if any of you have ever pulled on a spider web as a kid or even as an adult out of morbid curiosity, if I take this line here and I pull it, that orb web is going to distort. And think of this line on this orb web, and I pull and I look at carbon really close. I'll understand carbon, but only as part of a distorted ecological web. And once I get that understanding, the important thing, and let the web come back to its normal form, so I can judge exactly what was I looking at. I understood it as an exaggeration of its reality. And I worry that we're moving too fast with certain terms and certain ideas without letting the web come back and figuring out what its natural place is. So we have one more question. We have our last question now. So here we are, we're back onto this beautiful, beautiful graph. When we think of forest science, your interaction with a consulting forester is going to be taking the information from blue, green, and yellow, and you're going to be right in the tip of the yellow going into red. In the case of forestry, the innovation is in the answer to the goals and the methods to hit your value set, with the hope that that value set is stable enough that it can go through that life cycle of that plan. But it's not a given, so we usually have contingency. Do you feel that you have a good understanding of the term forest management? And so hopefully people are going to be answering that. So hopefully you find this, now that you've seen it 4 times, hopefully you'll remember this, that there's a continuum of how we look at research and development, and how science builds the pedestal in which we practice almost anything. Tonight, in our case, it's going to be about forestry. Okay, hopefully people are coming in. Oh, you're muted, I think. Okay. Oh, now Lori's muted. Is she back? Okay, Lori, I can't hear you.
I bet you can hear me now.
Yes, I can. Okay.
So we have 85%. So I'm going to end the poll and
Okay.
share the results. I think we're going to be happy with them.
Okay. Hey, good for all of you. You get a cookie at the end. We'll have catering delivered.
There you go.
Okay, we're getting long in the tooth here. So this goes to 8:30, correct? Okay, so
Yeah, 8:30, Jason. And we do have a couple questions in the Q&A, so give me some time at the end to address those questions, okay?
Unless you find a reason to do them now, but we'll just kind of go through here. Carbon is measured in many, many different ways. And when you look at people making a carbon argument, realize that they can report in carbon or they can report in carbon dioxide. And if they're doing one and not the other, you have to do a conversion. And it can be a little bit confusing because if we look at this, this is a really nice educational poster, but part of this is in short tons of carbon and also in metric tons of carbon dioxide. And so you have to be very careful in how you read certain pictures. And we're long in the tooth, so I'm just going to go through these slides long enough that if you see the recording, you can pause the recording and actually look at the pictures. But the idea is we take light as radiant energy, we capture it as sugar, as chemical energy, and that's how we get carbon from carbon dioxide locked in as a sugar. And it's all about energy flow. And then we take that sugar and we can either deploy it into storage as starches, or we can lock that simple sugar in a slightly different way and make something like cellulose. So there's a couple ways we play that game. And if you're a termite, you digest one way. If you're a human, you digest another. And if you're a human that wants to taste like a termite but not digest the sugar, then you get that stuff that is more cellulose and sweet tasting. But carbon's not the only thing. Well, carbon, as far as locking in the tree, is not the only thing. If we place the trees correctly, we can avoid carbon expenditures in our energy use, whether that's from wind, slowing wind down as it intercepts our house in the winter so that we decrease the loss of thermal units in our building, or whether that's shading in the summer so that we avoid cooling costs with our air conditioners. There's a lot of different ways we can use trees to influence our energy budgets. When we look at carbon, we're going to look at carbon pools in the above ground biomass. If we have our Superman, Superwoman X-ray eyes, the below ground biomass, which is where usually we just draw a gray box and say we think we know what's happening, but we don't. There's dead wood, there's forest litter, and then there's soil organic turnover, which is one of the really more happening things in New Jersey, to my mind, because if we have fewer and fewer days of snow-covered land, it means our land is warming sooner in the spring and staying warmer later in the fall, which means that this organic turnover is changing in ways we don't fully understand right now because we don't have snow on the ground as much as we used to. Just something to think about. Carbon flux, and you'll hear people talk about fluctuations. That's how the carbon is moving within the system. We have water. Okay, we have whole ecosystems based its structure around water. We have communities that base themselves around water as forest communities, and we can manage those communities to manage the water. Really important. We do that around all of our big reservoirs. You know, we have water forests to maintain the quality of water that's going through the aqueducts that's feeding our major cities. Now, if we were going to evaluate these on the basis of carbon, we would be big losers because these trees, well, they're really good as far as water forests, as far as dealing in these environments as hydric forest species, quite often like this beautiful seed, this is a Thuya occidentalis stand. It is really swampy in these areas. These things are miserable as far as getting carbon per the amount of water used. They are water profligate. So if you're worried about, this is not one you may want to use. You may not want to use this, but it may be the only thing that grows. And optimizing the carbon on something like this is probably not what you want. You want to stabilize So when we think about our forestation, afforestation, reforestation, proforestation, it's not simply about a carbon argument, it's probably about a water argument. And you shouldn't look at it just one way. If you understand water, you understand the success or failure of the system. As goes the soil, goes the plants, as go the plants, so goes the animals. But if you understand the water, you'll understand the success or failure of the system. So it's worth paying some attention to. And it brings us to our last, coming out of ecology. This is an excellent text. Out of the 6 texts that I used to teach a forest ecology course, this is the one I force the students to buy, and I lecture out of the rest of them. Really good book. If you're looking for one, this is a great Christmas present. Okay, but ecology is a discipline of study. This is part of that continuum of basic to tactical research and how we deploy it into application. Ecology and the use and understanding of ecology is a great dispassionate informant to our management. And as we increase our understanding of ecology, we modulate our deployment in forestry, because forestry is the management of an ecological system. That's the way it's always been. So we want to be thinking about that. And some of the 3 big words that we're going to use: diversity. Diversity is pretty simple. It's how many different things do you have? And we can count that. We can count all sorts of stuff. But it's not simply enough to have a lot of different things. They have to be functional components. I think of it like a university. If you look at faculty at a modern major university, we're very much like a dysfunctional zoo in many ways. We get one of each person, never 2 for budgetary reasons, lest they breed in intellectual thought. We'll call it multidisciplinary, and we'll force them to hybridize. Okay, but sometimes it's not enough to have one of everything. You need to have 2 or 3, and then you get a business school or a football team, for all I know. But the idea here is that diversity can speak to just how many different things you have, but that's not enough. You have to talk about how they're functional in the system. So we tend to look at their importance level or evenness assessment of how those things are displayed and how the populations are skewed so things can reproduce and keep going. I hope that makes sense, because when we look at that, how do our choices in forest management or any land management enable or discourage ancillary diversification benefits? If I move from an oak community to a poplar community, number one, I don't know why you do that, but I had to come up with an example. So bear with me here. The insect communities in an oak tree are going to be very different than the insect communities in that poplar. And so are my choices in forest structure going to enable or discourage ancillary diversification in different areas of the food web? We want to be thinking about it. But we're not going to just count species. That's the easy thing. We want to think about our habitats, diversification of our habitats, because by diversification of our habitats and maintaining and conserving our soil, we're going to ensure diversification of guilds, niches, and food webs. And so it's not just the simple stuff. It has to be some of that more considered work. If it's all old growth forest, you lose all of the occupants and specialists of the younger stage forest development. And so we're seeing more and more this push to keep things over 100 years moving in a good trajectory. But we're also having concerns that we're losing that younger. And the great conversation is, when is it appropriate to go for one versus the other? And that's a useful conversation to have. It's like an investment portfolio. You don't want to have all of one's, nobody wants all of GameStop right now. If I had an investment strategy, I wouldn't want GameStop today. All right, so what we do is we spread the portfolio so that in contingency, if something happens, we don't lose everything. Think of our old forests like chestnut that had chestnut blight wipe it out. We had white oak forests where gypsy moth has done its damage. American elm was really good in certain urban environments and wet environments until Dutch elm disease kind of took those things out. So we want a diversification in our portfolio scale. And when we think about diversity, I just pulled this out of a chapter of the Kimmons forest ecology class. There's habitat diversity, the structural diversity of the layers, diversity within your diversity as far as your families and types of things that are coming in. You have species diversity, you have age diversity, but in forest ecology, temporal diversity is one of the most fundamental of the biological diversity considerations because things change over time. And so this is the one we spend a lot of time on. It's not the forest of today. It was the forest of decades ago and decades to come. And when we look at that, we look at it in multiple spatial scales. We have the stand level, that's an identifiable unit with uniform conditions that we can manage as a unit. We have the local landscape, which is built up out of many stands, and then regions have many local landscapes. And from there, we can move to global patterning of biological diversity. And that's where we get, you know, hypothesis, the time hypothesis, that's the crux of proforestation out of the presumption of the tropical forests where we had very low human population densities, so very low anthropomorphic or anthropogenic disturbance regimes. Because we have the benefit of time without disruption. But the last I knew, New Jersey is not an equatorial place. Our daylight, nighttime, seasonality things get in the way. But that, you know, when we get to the time hypothesis, that's where we start getting into that whole idea of proforestation in the long game. And it's a worthy conversation, but into management, we talk about when we're doing a plan for a stand, we're always taught, actually we're punished until we get it right in classes, that you think about at least the next layer above. So if I'm worried about stand, I'm trying to link into forest. And if I'm dealing forests, I'm trying to link into landscape. I'm always considering the next layer above me in the plan that I'm working for today. That's the perspective that you should be getting out of your consulting forester. Let's get to sustainability because we're running a bit long in the tooth. Sustainability is the ability to carry on over a scale of time. And there's financial sustainability. If you have to spend money every year to keep it going, is it really that sustainable? The year you can't afford it, your system falls apart. You can't keep a forest in a sustainable manner if you have to keep putting money into it or energy into it and never get anything out of it, because the person with the burden of that ownership and management has to make it functional so that they can do it, even if it's now the good of their own heart, even if it's for an ecological purpose. We have to consider the financials. We have to consider the management sustainability. The idea is to do as little as possible and let nature do it for you. And we guide it slightly, but we tried to do it with people are inconsequential in the workings of a forest until we really start mucking about. But the thing is, If your management is that intense, it's not really sustainable. And then what if your social values change? It's a beautiful forest and we want to conserve it, but we just lost the homes for 35 million people on the East Coast to seawater rise. Where are they going to live? Boy, maybe that forest needs to be used for food or for people. Ecological sustainability flips this and looks about functions. It's not about the players, it's about the functions. And we try to conscribe to favor our historic communities, but only if the environment doesn't change away from those historic communities. And then resilience, our last word, is the ability to bounce back from a disruption. We'll call that a disturbance. That can be an individual tree that's being eaten by 18-year cicadas because they go up and they wring out the twigs. And so you'll notice that a lot of trees where you have the cicadas this year, you're going to see a lot of tip dieback. Those trees will be fine next year. Okay, they're resilient, but that happens. It happens. It's rather loud. It's really cool. And the cicada has a really nutty flavor. If you ever want to eat them, they're actually quite good. Anyways, it can be something as mild as a cicada to something like we were talking about a Mount St. Helens resetting event or a Superstorm Sandy resetting event. That interruption can be reliably cyclic. We know that every 7 years, like clockwork, there's a major ice storm along the St. Lawrence Seaway. We don't know where, but somewhere in that forest system, there's going to be a huge ice storm. And it's just going to blow the heck out of a lot of canopies. But with the cicadas, there's a specialized fungus that has an 18-year gestation period specifically to digest the male cicada from the inside out. So when they start flying around in the air, they literally explode, blowing all the spores out to lay dormant for the next 17, 18 years. Isn't that wonderful? It's a beautiful thing. Whenever the environment changes faster than a plant can grow, we're going to call that a biological stress. Trees grow at multiple time scales. Our environment's changing on multiple time scales. This idea of stress and the ability of a tree to keep balance, to adapt to its environment, that is what the game is all about. I am long in the tooth. I apologize. I'm actually feeling good for the first time in a couple of days, so I'm having fun if you're not. I just point out there's this thing called NJ Forest Adapt. You just type that into your system. It should work. You click on Start Collecting Maps, and you can see you can collect a data theme on your county or your township on climate, on your forest stand and carbon characteristics, on species distribution, and future projections of what species are the winners and losers in climate change in your area. So this is actually a US Forest Service product, but this is a place that's trying to be a one-stop shop to give you some background information so you can talk to your consulting forester about what it is that's really on your mind, so they can craft a better plan for you. And then finally, there are these things called tiny forests. This is aforestation. We all know what aforestation is, but it's not really a forest. I think of it as a terrarium. You know, you function in a high intensity process, but is it really a forest? And the answer is I don't think so, because the scale is wrong. It has a value. But even if I have 50 mini forests, as an aggregate, I can't really call it a forest. Because as far as sustainability goes, I'm not sure that they meet the test. But the idea here, and it's called the Milwaukee Method, basically you're going to take an area, you're going to totally revamp the soil, and then you're going to plant the entire forest community and all a garden up to a couple of years until the things you want take off. And then it's poof, you've got a forest in their mind. And our examples are usually in tropical systems or semi-tropical systems. I don't think they grow that fast in New Jersey, but I think it's a useful thing to look at. But here is a mini forest. So these are the people, they're calling this a forest. They're not calling it a stand within a forest. They're calling it a forest. And in 50 to 60 years, trees and some understory, but I'm not sure I'd call that a forest. So it's something that we ought to be looking at. It's really kind of cool. But the idea here is that you plant everything all at once and you make it happen through a lot of artificial recruitment and a lot of energy on your part. And sure, are you going to capture carbon here? Definitely. How much carbon are you going to spend to make that thing viable for capture by lifting all of the soil out, changing all of it with your machinery, and then trucking all the plant material in? And how are you doing all this? So think about that. It's really kind of cool. And with that, I'm over time. I apologize. But let's go through questions. I've got time if you can.
Okay, sure. And I don't think anybody's complaining about you being over, because the comments in the chat are just amazing. Everybody's super, super excited about everything that you presented. So thank you.
Well, that's good. That's good looking.
Yeah, well, actually, they say you're much more interesting than George Clooney. So you have a fan, you have a fan club.
But am I even close to Karen? You teach a kid everything he knows and then he eclipses you. It's a terrible thing.
Oh, stop. Yeah, just a shame that he's not here to hear that,
I know, but I know he'll watch the tape.
Absolutely. And I'll tell him to go to, 92 minutes so he can be sure to hear it. So good. So one question just that was in the chat, because I don't want to forget, is Judy wanted to know if you have any recommended resources for learning more about forests and tree root systems. Now, I know we had a couple books that you had posted pictures of. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
There are a couple of texts that I refer to, but they're about roots in general. And I suffer from male mental pause. I invoked it early, lowered expectations by family. So I'll write a couple of those books down. One's called Roots, the Hidden Half. There are some very good books on forest soils, and it's hard to discuss forest soils without talking about root systems.
Fantastic. And you know what we can do, Jason, is since we recorded this, I will offer the recording to everybody that attended, and we can put some of those resources in that email. So maybe over the next couple days, if you can shoot me some information.
Let's say mid next week, I can do that. Just hound me to make sure that I get
shall.
the list.
Okay, perfect. And another thing that a couple people have asked for was the link to get to the Forest Connect. I'm sorry,
NJ Forest Adapt.
Yeah.
I don't know the link. I just type in, I go on to Google Chrome and I type in NJ space forest space adapt, and it comes up.
Okay.
That's how I can't remember that stuff. But it comes up on top of the search.
Okay, and I can always put the link in our follow-up email as well.
Yeah, I think it's something like njforestadapt.edu or something like that. But it comes up very quickly if you just type in those words in your search.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the questions, and we'll try to keep it brief since it is 8:34 or whatever. But I will. I'll ask them and
another beer. Let's keep.
There you go. Maybe get a couple snacks. It's all good.
Yeah.
Annabelle wanted to know, could afforestation be a relevant management technique for trying to bring a biodiverse community back into a desert or a very hot, arid land? I was thinking about that actually when you were saying that.
Yeah.
What do they do?
Well, they manage water. If we look at, all of the advances in how we deal with hydrogels and water management in Israel, by and large, were questions of desertification and pushing back against that for food production and forest production. If we look at, what was the name of, lady won the Nobel Prize, Iguru Matai, I think it was, reforesting Africa so that they could do water management and fight desertification in the Green Belt movement. That was the name of the book. Back in the day, I had hair back then. But the whole idea there was you get the trees in there and you're going to nurture the trees until they can stabilize the system and start building their own aspect to tree root growth that we call the hydraulic lift theory that comes out of Todd Dawson's shop at Cornell University. I have to spit when I say Cornell, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm a Cornellian. I'm allowed to do that because I paid my tuition, and still am. Anyway, but yeah, what we do is it's about artificial recruitment, soil stabilization, and then you're attributing part of your water budget to the plant water budget until you can get that stabilization. And then it's a series of steps.
Okay, fantastic.
I would do the Green Belt movement, and that's a great launch pad to then start building your own discovery of breadcrumbs.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, Zachary has a question. Now we're into Proforestation. What do you see as the obstacles to adding Proforestation to the toolkit of land management options where it is appropriate to allow a maturing forest stand to live out its natural life? And why is there so much resistance to this natural stewardship alternative?
I'm going to attack the first question in that, and that is, what are the challenges?
Yeah, what are the obstacles to adding that to the toolkit?
I think the only obstacle is trying not to get ahead of one's skis. The objectives of Proforestation are the objectives of forestry in general. But I think, it's a difference in approach in some people that want to do this natural, holistic, hands-off aspect, which can be very appropriate. And quite often, one of the first questions is, do I do anything or I do nothing? It really is about the values that you're trying to get out of the system. And so part of it's going to be how your client or how the landowner wants to phrase the question, and is that value consistent with the system you're trying to manage? I don't think that anybody has an objection to Proforestation because, like I said, that is not a management style. That is a proposition and an attitude. And we're conflating the intensity question of forestry with the operationalization of forestry. And if you want to say that I want to move my forest in a certain direction, and I want to have that be a very low impact, low input, that's fine. But we want to be clear that all forests die. So if that is the proposition, we don't really know how long that forest gets to last. But we do know when we put our eggs into the basket of maximizing age structures, that only the most dominant species, which limits your diversification in that area of the forest, you're putting your eggs in a very small basket. And on an individual stand basis, I don't see there's any objection to that. Making that a policy across multiple stands, you're failing to move up to the next level where the risks are very different. So what was the second part of the question?
Why is there so much resistance to this natural stewardship alternative?
I don't think that the resistance is to a natural stewardship position. I think that there is a resistance or a perception that there's a conflation between stewardship and abandonment. The forests that we're trying to emulate or recreate, as it were managed systems by indigenous peoples long before the Europeans came and set a benchmark point of what the forests used to look like. Where we have problems and resistance is in the proposition that we know what's going to happen as trees go beyond 130, 140 years, when we simply have no data and we really don't have really good notes to feel comfortable in taking that full risk. But I don't think there's any opposition in taking steps to watch and to move and to adapt. I think it's really about how far people are pushing, and just like any good debate, the harder one side pushes, the other side's going to feel obliged to push just as hard in the opposite direction until we get some good, reasoned, polite, earnest, and open discussion. I think that's going to be the issue. And I hope I didn't tick you off too bad.
Nope.
But that's where I'm standing.
Yep. And Zach has already said thank you for your response. So thank you for your response. So Peter, we're going to go into a water question. So Peter says, fabulous New Jersey centric program, Jason. So yeah, thank you again. So they live in Monmouth County, where we basically seem to live on top of an underground lake system. It's Deal Lake, Interlaken.
Mhm.
So that one slide where you had that green all along the edge, we're all worried now, right? I'm not going to buy that shore house for sure. Should we be worried about flooding in the next 10 years? Seems so. Saw Ortley Beach, Tom's River throwing $500,000 at replenishing beach erosion this week. Will be funded federally. How is this sustainable? Speaking of sustainability, right?
Well,
Need to worry?
I'm worried. I'm not sure as if that means much, because I don't have the money to have the influence to drive investments for beach replenishment, which is non-sustainable. But we knew that was a problem when we were telling people not to develop on the primary dune back in the 1960s. And we saw people build on these dunes and say, I don't care about the insurance, I'm just going to do this. And now they're saying we need protection. It's amazing how people's values change once they're in a position where they've got something to lose versus something to gain. But yes, we ought to be thoughtful about these things. And it's interesting that are probably going to be more about water than they're going to be about anything else. So we probably ought to start getting really savvy about how we capture, how we stage, and how we deploy water in our freshwater systems. That's a forestry question as much as anything else. And so I feel rather strongly about that, because my feeling is, if I'm on a water's edge and I have sea level rise, I have the financial means to go and buy up land somewhere else next to water where money is relatively no object. And how do we protect those? Because that's our drinking water. So how we conserve our lands, and which lands do we conserve, and which lands do we let go in a meaningful way, knowing that it hurts to let anything go, but there's probably going to be something's got to give when it comes to the disposition of some of our forested lands. We better be ready to know how we want that conversation so that we're in a proactive position rather than a reactive position.
Yeah, always better to be proactive than reactive, for sure.
I hope that addresses your question.
Okay, Peter, if there's anything else, feel free to put something in the chat and we'll try to address additional. So I'm going to move on because I'm just going to throw this in right now because Doug told us that McDonald's now has cicada snacks. They're Makeda nuggets. And apparently they have a nutty flavor too. So
They do. They really, really do. And let's face it, as an insect, it's awesome because it's the only insect that successfully stopped a Bob Dylan concert.
there you go. There you go. And, you know, I'm not really one for eating insects, but since this is only every 17 years, I think we all have to just say it right now. We have to at least try it. Okay. I can't believe I'm saying that. So Doug, thank you. I'll go out and get some Makeda nuggets.
And they are so high protein.
There you go. It's healthy.
Paleo. They're so paleo.
Okay, moving on. I just had to put that in there. Bill wants to know, as you remove trees, either through logging or simply removing dead trees, it seems that you would reduce carrying capacity, correct? Putting logging aside, does this suggest merit in having dead trees mulched and redistributed at the site?
Well, there's a couple good questions there. One is, if you know, Dr. Schenk, when he started the Biltmore School, the first school of practical forestry in the US, his favorite line that he smacked around kids with was, every good forestry question is actually a good transportation question. And when we think about forestry, it's about getting that material out. He was talking, it was about extraction, forestry of biomass for timbers because we were building this nation thing. But now that could be environmental services such as habitat. It is not a given that logging would influence site capacity on the long game if you do it carefully and you do not inordinately damage the soil. That will, and if you want an example of that, you go down to Double Trouble State Park, talk with some of the state forestry employees, and they will show you about years, they're back to what they were before the disturbance. So, you know, in the longer game, no, logging does not have to influence carrying capacity. What occupies that site, that's a slightly different argument, but I think that, you know, you could say that there's meatier questions there.
Yeah.
Mulching things on site, that is an option. You mulch something up as coarse woody debris, I think I'd rather just leave it because it costs me less energy to just leave it. However, now you've got something that if the wrong yeasty beastie gets in, you've got a problem. But if it's the right yeasty beastie, it's going to be part of the natural cycle. But if we see a large transition and you've got a lot of stuff on the ground, salvage logging is all about taking that locked carbon and moving it to a different usage where it stays locked for a longer period of time than just being digested and re-respired back as carbon dioxide back out of the system. So I think that there's a more nuanced question with that. One of the bigger questions nationally, I used to sit on the National Advisory Panel for Secretary of Agriculture on forest research. How much of that debris should we leave now that we've got better tools to pre-grind and accelerate that process? There's some open research questions there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That's a good answer. I know it's it's not as simple to just, you know, say yes or no or whatever. So that's a good answer. Okay. We're going to talk tiny forests.
Cool.
Yeah. So Cora has this question. She actually rephrased it. So I'll ask the rephrased version. How small can a tiny forest be? Her original question was, what's the average size of a tiny forest? So what are we talking here?
I've heard the size of a tennis court.
Okay.
I could imagine that we could talk about the size of 5 parking spaces. I think that the idea with this, think of a vest pocket park or where we have a vacant lot. Add into a tiny forest, and the answer is yes. So 1/10 of an acre, that could work. better question, if I have that kind of vacant land, am I in the middle of a food desert? And would it be better for me to build a tiny forest-like thing? Because this is just horticulture now. This is not forestry. But you build that same kind of a system, but just happen to have all edible, so that you solve the food desert problem while introducing an environmental interaction, especially because they're probably in areas where dispossessed populations are. And so there's a social justice benefit by looking at food as well as forestry in these systems.
Okay, good suggestion for sure. Okay, and then Doug has a question about how critical are the forest floor interactions between trees and fungi in symbiotic relationships?
I would suggest that an entire evolutionary sequence doesn't tell tales. They're imperative.
Okay. Okay, I think we have all the questions answered. A lot of praise, a lot of thank yous and all that stuff. Andy, anything to add before we wrap it up?
No, I think it's all been very good. It's been very informational.
I can't hear you, Andy.
Oh, I can though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's been very good. Jason, thank you very much. It's been, and one of the things that I do in these sessions is I keep track of how many people participate and when they start dropping off. And we had people started and they stayed on the whole time. Actually, we didn't see a real drop off until 8:35 or so. So we went more than 90 minutes and we kept almost everybody. So it was just it was a terrific presentation, a lot of good information, very thought provoking. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. I think it's been great.
Glad to help out. This was my pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So, all right. So we all need to try cicadas when they come out. What do we have, like a month or two to get our palette in order, right? And you and I will touch base again mid next week. I'll get the recording pulled down. We'll put in some additional data for our participants and we'll get an email out to everybody. Okay. So thank you again. Thank you for everybody that joined us tonight. And hopefully we'll see you again in May. We'll be putting out an announcement on presenter and topic shortly. So I hope everybody has a great rest of their evening and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.